Today we'll be discussing the stratagems in the Guard Codex, where we can really get the most bang for our buck out of our command points. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So the Imperial Guard is an army that can get a lot of CP very easily by filling out some ludicrously cheap battalions. 180 points for 2 company commanders and 3 infantry squads is our go-to staple, and then from there we can pretty much add whatever other units that we want from all the other slots in the battalions. You can even get this even cheaper now if you use the new cheaper Militarum Tempestus Scion squads, so access to command points aren't really a problem. That means that we really need to find the best way of converting all of this command point goodness into appreciable, worthwhile effects for our army. So with that in mind, today we're going to look through all of the stratagems in the Guard Codex and talk about which ones will get you the most return on the battlefield for those command points. We are going to be focusing on the Guard Codex ones today, rather than the ones available in Vigilus and in the Greater Good Book. I've discussed the Greater Good Book ones a bit more fully in the new Greater Good Book review that I did, but I will talk about some of the most notable ones at the end of the video. I've broken the stratagems down into 3 different categories. The first ones that I feel are fairly low yield and I wouldn't typically use myself. The middle ones which have some good situational uses or can provide you with a reliable medium return on your investment, and the ones that really can make a massive difference to the game and I'd frequently use in a Guard army. So let's jump right into it then. So we'll start with the ones that I think are slightly lower yield and explain why. Firstly, the Vortex Missile stratagem for 3 command points boosts the mortal wound output from your Death Strike missile. Unfortunately, it costs a whopping 3 command points, and Death Strikes are pretty unreliable to be able to fire in the first place, and if they ever get the chance to, they don't necessarily do enough damage to justify their points cost. If the Death Strike was cheaper, then this would be better, but until then I just really can't see myself ever using it. Next up, for 3 command points, we have Fire on My Position, which happens when the last member of a squad with a Voxcaster is slain in close combat. Each unit within 3 inches of the squad will suffer D3 mortal wounds on a roll of a 4+. This could be useful if it didn't cost you 3 command points, which is absolutely enormous for the amount of mortal wounds that you can ever expect from it. Even if the stars aligned, and you somehow had 6 enemy units within that range, then even then you'd only do an average of 6 mortal wounds for 3 command points. It's not bad, but it's not overwhelming either. Plus it means that you have to take Voxcasters, and not everyone does, so it's not even usable for those who don't. Next up, for 2 command points, we have Officio Perfectas Command Tank, the one that gives a Lehman Russ tank a 6-inch aura of Leadership 9. Now this could genuinely help out with some Guard morale issues, but to be honest we have quite a lot of ways of getting boosts to morale on the board. In particular, the easiest one would just be to buy a Lord Commissar or a regular Commissar, who will do that work for you without having to spend 2 command points on it, which could be better used elsewhere. Plus the enemy might just shoot your command tank, then you're left without any leadership, so your infantry are going to be taking more unnecessary casualties to morale, compared with if you'd use a Commissar or Lord Commissar, which can't be shot directly. Next we have Mobile Command Vehicle, which is the one which allows an officer to issue an order from inside a Chimera, so the theory is he can stay safe while he's issuing orders. In general though, the vast majority of the time, you could just get him out of the Chimera with the squad and order the squad there, rather than wasting a command point having your commander hang around in the Chimera. If you really want him safe, it's usually possible to deploy him behind the Chimera out of line of sight, but still within order range of the squad that got out. For a couple of orders, this one isn't usually worth it. Next we have Preliminary Bombardment, which is 2 command points and is the one that you do before the battle begins, and you roll a d6 for every enemy unit in the enemy army, and on a 6 they take a mortal wound. Now this could be good in truly massive games and might actually be worth it in something like an Apocalypse game where you have literally hundreds of enemy units on the other side, but in most typical 2000 point games of 40k I can't really see it being worth the bother. Just scattering a few single mortal wounds over the enemy army isn't particularly worthwhile. If it's on tanks, it's not usually going to make a meaningful difference as to whether or not you kill said tank. Characters in general still won't care, they'll still have a fair few wounds left, and are still only going to die when you get your men and guns to them. I'd say the place I'd be most inclined to use it is if you're playing against an army that has a whole ton of very elite infantry that 1 mortal wound could remove a member of the squad, and that could genuinely reduce their damage output. Things like multiple units of Dark Reapers spring to mind, where each casualty is going to be particularly painful. Bear in mind though, even if your opponent has, say, 18 units, you're essentially spending 2 command points for 3 randomly scattered mortal wounds, which isn't typically a very good trade-off. Next we have Grenadiers. This is 1 command point to make your squad throw 10 grenades rather than just 1. where the main issue with this is that you can usually replicate the same effect with first rank, second rank fire for better damage. However, it does have some situational uses. Maybe I should have pushed it in the next tier up. A big squad of Scions could get to work on the enemy with 10 crack grenades, although this does have the opportunity cost of shooting with whatever weapons you did equip them with. And more notably, a big squad of Bulgarin could use this to throw a whole ton of frag bombs at the enemy, which is actually fairly meaningful as they don't have any shooting in the first place if you just give them the maul and shield. So typically I'd say Bulgarin are the best place to use this. In general, for just frag grenades on infantry squads, we already have quite a lot of strength 3 shooting, particularly through first rank, second rank fire. In normal circumstances, even on a full 10-man squad, this isn't going to be worth it. Next we have Go Recon, a 1 command point, 1 for Sentinels, which basically gives up its shooting for an extra 2d6 inch movement. Again, I can see this being situationally useful if you want your Sentinel to get onto an objective, which to be honest is basically the only time I'd really tend to use it. For those times it's certainly worth remembering that it exists, but I wouldn't use it with any sort of regularity, as giving up the Sentinel's shooting for more manoeuvrability isn't usually the biggest deal in the world. Next up we have a few of the regimental specific stratagems, including Send in the Next Wave, the Valhallan one that my commissar on the thumbnail for this video likes. Now this was basically a reasonably interesting stratagem that Games Workshop nerfed in the FAQ. Basically you have to pick a destroyed infantry unit from your army and you can set it up back in your deployment zone for 2 command points, bringing in the next wave of the same unit for example. The problem is in match play you have to pay reinforcement points over this, which means that you're sacrificing units that could have been in your army in the first place, dealing damage and securing objectives from turn 1. Now there is some play to this one. You could recycle the units that you most feel that you need in the game. Say if your opponent has a whole ton of elite infantry, if your plasma vets get killed then you could choose to bring them back in one game. Or if you feel you just need a whole load more bodies to hold objectives, you could maybe recycle a unit of conscripts or something. In reality though, with 2 command points on top of the cost of these units that you've already left out of your army, it's just not worth it to bother. So it was a nice idea, but at the moment as it stands, the command point cost and reinforcement point costs completely kill it for me. Next up we have the one that was heavily nerfed, which was the Mordian Volley Fire stratagem. This one used to be completely bonkers because every time you rolled a 6 to hit with a weapon, you'd be able to fire the entire weapon again when you've used this stratagem on a Mordian infantry squad. So say if you were firing some veterans with plasma guns and 2 of them got 6s, you'd be able to fire another 2 plasma guns at the enemy. This got particularly silly with las guns as well, with first rank, second rank, where every 6 that you rolled would get you another 4 las gun shots, and this becomes absolutely through the roof if you combined it with Vengeance for Cadia, which gave you loads of rerolls and therefore loads more 6s. Games Workshop decided to heavily rein in this silliness, and now if you make that 6 to hit, then you just get 1 additional shot with the weapon, so it's essentially a pretty weak buff to a standard infantry squad's shooting. It's most worth it on the biggest, most elite infantry unit that you have, something like veterans with plasma guns or a big combined infantry squad, but even then it's not exactly overwhelming. It basically amounts to a 17% buff to your unit's damage output. For me this isn't typically going to be worth a command point, as guard infantry units just aren't threatening enough to justify that for 1 command point. It is a bit of a shame in the way, as this was basically the only competitive thing that Mordians had. The rest of their rules just aren't all that strong. Next up we have the Kashchan stratagem, Vicious Traps. This means that when your opponent charges a Kashchan unit that's in cover on a 4+, your Vicious Traps can give them D3 mortal wounds. Handing out some surprise mortal wounds isn't terrible, but the fact that this only happens on a 4+ means that you're actually just paying 1 command point for, on average, 1 mortal wound. Sometimes perhaps could be worth it if you're being charged by a character that's very injured and this might be the difference that finishes them off, but in all honesty very situational to bother with for me. Finally we have the Armageddon Steel Legion Armoured Fist, which is 1 command point to reroll 1s for an infantry unit that got out of a transport this turn. Could perhaps be handy for plasma veterans where you can't get any orders to the unit and you don't want them frying them with their own plasma, or perhaps for an infantry squad that you're already stacking with first rank, second rank fire. But either way, it does remain that it's still a mediocre damage buff to a guard infantry unit, and this one has very specific activation conditions, so it's kind of an even worse version of Mordian Volley Fire. Very rarely going to be actually worth the command points compared with other things you can use. So that's my least favourite tier out of the way. Let's get to the middle tier of guard stratagems, things that can be situationally very useful, or command points that will give you a reasonable amount of damage output increase. First up we have Crush Them, which as I've said on virtually every vehicle overview so far in this series, is typically best on your guard tank when it's going to make the difference whether or not they get to shoot the next turn, so spending 1 command point to have the chance of freeing your Lehman Russ tank from the machinations of 1 lone infantry model and allowing it to open fire with all guns can certainly be worth the gamble of a command point. This one gets far stronger though when you're using it on a Baneblade or other guard super heavy, where it actually increases the damage output and can cause the tank to do real damage in close combat. So 2 decent uses, definitely one to remember. Next up we have Aerial Spotter. This is the one that allows a Basilisk or Wyvern to re-roll the hit dice when it makes a shooting attack this phase. Now I think that this one is borderline worth it, but not one to use every single turn. You're essentially giving your Basilisk or Wyvern a 50% damage increase. Now these guys don't have the biggest damage output in the first place, so in normal circumstances I don't actually think that it's worth doing this every turn. Interestingly though, I think it can become viable if you're already souping them up with numerous other things. You can really stack a lot of buffs on Wyverns and Basilisks, such as shooting twice with the Vigilus formation, making them a tank ace for a flat 3 damage from Basilisks, having things that give them rerolls to wounds such as Old Grudges or the Cadian Relic of Lost Cadia, and perhaps other stratagems such as overlapping fields of fire. If you're putting multiple buffs on this Basilisk and Wyvern, then this becomes a lot more viable to throw into that big mix, as you're stacking even more buffs on an already very strong unit. So I'd recommend not for normal use, only if you're using a lot of stratagems on a Basilisk or Wyvern already. Next we have Jury Rigging for 1 command point. This is the one that you use at the start of your shooting phase to regain a wound on any guard vehicle. Typically I don't think that this one's worth it for the amount of actual healing it does for the tank, but what it is good for is if your tank has just been bracketed, needs 1 wound to get back up to be hitting a little bit better, and that can often be worth 1 command point. If it makes the difference between a Lehman Russ tank hitting on 5s and hitting on 4s, as well as the defensive increase it gives you, that's typically a command point well spent. It's not absolutely game changing or overwhelming, but it is a nice to have. Next for 1 command point we have Consolidate Squads. This is the option to put 2 infantry squads together, creating a bigger 20-man unit. Now this can either be good for denying kill points to the opponent, maybe hoovering up some special weapons that are left isolated on the battlefield, but it's more typically used for putting 2 big infantry squads together, meaning that you have a very big infantry squad that you can use other buffs on. Say if you suddenly have 20 guardsmen that are now protected by Night Shroud and Psychic Barrier from some astropaths, and then they can be a very good target for other damage increasing stratagems, as we'll see later. It can come with the downside of making the big squad quite susceptible to running away with morale, but in the right game this can be extremely powerful indeed. Next we have Ambush, the Talon stratagem that allows you to put up to 3 units in reserve for the investment of 3 command points. This one is genuinely one of the reasons that is particularly good to play Talon, as this isn't restricted to just infantry. You can use it on tanks and things, and can use it to keep the stuff like tank commanders safe and have them come in at the best possible angle on turn 2. It is a little bit pricey for a reserve mechanic, but it really helps to give them even more mobility, which can be very handy for Imperial Guard, as reaching backline objectives can be pretty hard to do, so outflanking an infantry squad or 2 to do that is pretty good. Superior Intelligence is the Militarum Tempestus one, which is sort of like Auspex scan. When an enemy unit turns up from reserve within 12 inches of the squad, they can immediately shoot at it as if it were a shooting phase, but you must subtract 1 from the hit rolls. Now, Militarum Tempestus infantry aren't typically to be all over the board, but this is really one that's good to remember if your opponent is bringing in reserves, as they certainly can have some decently strong firepower if you're loading them up with special weapons. For just 1 command point, you could do quite a lot of damage to an enemy unit like this. Next we have Inspired Tactics, which is 1 command point to issue an additional order either from a tank commander or a regular commander with the Voice of Command ability. Typically I find this more use on tank commanders as their orders are in shorter supply, but if you absolutely have to have 3 orders coming out of your company commander, then sometimes it could be worth it. Just weigh up as to whether or not you could live without the least useful of the 3 orders, compared with spending this command points. I typically don't tend to use this very much at all on infantry, but on tanks it can be good if you've got a tank commander next to a regular Lehman Russ. Being able to strike and shroud or re-rolling 1s on plasma weapons could be worse. Next up we have Defensive Gunners, 1 command point to make your tank or vehicle hit on 5s. Is often better as a deterrent than an actual increase in firepower, but in some situations it can be very powerful. On Lehman Russes it can genuinely deal a reasonable amount of damage to incoming charges, though I do find it very rarely actually tends to stop the charge from taking place, even if you do deal a bit of damage. It's probably strongest on things like super heavy tanks, where it can make them a very nasty prospect to charge indeed. Finally, for 1 command point we have Fight to the Death. This is the one that allows you to roll a d3 rather than a d6 for a leadership test, so it can be a nice alternative to spending 2 command points to make them fearless. I typically tend to use this if you just need 1 person from the squad to survive, say if they're holding an objective and they might fail their morale test. You can usually math it out to mean that even if you roll a 3, it means that the squad will definitely survive if that's what you need to happen. I don't think it's typically worth it for the amount of actual guardsmen it saves, but if it could be really useful to have 1 guardsman survive this turn in that particular position, either for scoring objectives or maybe tying up other units, then it's often worth the command point. Now we get to the really strong ones then, some of the strongest options that we have to offer for our command points. First up, the extra relics are usually an excellent use of command points, particularly the first one where you buy one extra one for 1 command point. Some of the guard relics are game-changingly strong. That Hammer of Sunderance from the Vigilist detachment is amazing. The Relic of Lost Cadia is amazing if you are playing Cadians, and if you have nothing else to spend it on, then Kirov's Aquila is usually a good buy, as this one will typically pay more command points than it lost if you only spend 1 command point on it. There are a whole bunch of other options which can be handy depending on what army you're playing exactly. I far prefer the things that buff your units rather than try and make a guard commander more fighty or more survivable in close combat. But I do think that this stratagem is one of the best uses for us spending our command points to make meaningful differences on the game. Next we have Take Cover, which is an excellent reactive defensive buff. 1 command point to increase the save characteristic on your infantry units is very, very powerful indeed, even when we're talking about things as lowly as guardsmen. The best thing is that unlike some other rules, this doesn't just give them the benefit of cover, this actually increases their save. So if you have a guard squad that's in cover on an objective, then this will actually give them a 3+ save if they're already in cover. And it can even be combined with things like an Astropath's Psychic Barrier, meaning that your standard guardsman could have a 2+ save while on an objective, if they feel like pretending to be Terminators for a turn. Of course, the place where it shines even higher is on your big Bulgrin Death Star. Where they already have a 2+ save, they could have an Astropath cast Psychic Barrier for a 1+ save, this could give them a 0+ save, and then if they happen to be in cover as well, then even AP-3 weapons would still have them saving on 2s. Of course 1s always fail in all of these scenarios, so mass fire can still take them down, but being able to basically ignore anything that's high AP is incredibly useful indeed. Bear in mind that this one doesn't affect vehicles or units with invul saves, as per the Guard FAQ, but even on infantry, it's still incredibly strong indeed. Even if the unit still dies, they might take up a lot more enemy firepower to take them down. Next up we have Overlapping Fields of Fire, the Cadian unique stratagem, and this one costs 2 command points and it triggers after you've caused a wound on one of your opponent's units. From then on, the entire rest of your Cadian army gets +1 to hit said unit. Now the value of this one can go absolutely through the roof, depending on just how many guns you can line up on the same target. Having an army-wide +1 to hit is absolutely fantastic for 2 command points, and it can really help focus down your opponent's most scary threat in 1 turn. It can sometimes be worth it to have something like a sniper squad, try and fish for mortal wounds to try and get that initial wound off so you can have all of your big guns firing with +1 to hit. It's overall an absolutely great stratagem, and is certainly a solid draw to playing as the Cadians. Finally, we have the Vostroyan stratagem for 1 command point, Firstborn Pride. This one is simple and effective, 1 command point to make 1 unit get +1 to hit. It is less powerful than Overlapping Fields, but it requires less setup and less thought put into it. You can just increase the damage on the single unit that needs it the most, obviously going to be better on the bigger units that you can target with it, such as Baneblades or Tank Commanders. In particular, having Tank Commanders hitting on 2s is absolutely great. It can also keep you safe from plasma overcharging, and you can stack this with various other buffs that you might be able to get, such as orders, warlord traits, or other stratagems. Now there's one stratagem that hasn't come up yet, and that stratagem is Vengeance for Cadia. I know that this one is specific to facing chaos, but if you are, then this is very much the best stratagem out of the entire Guard Codex. Just 1 command point to give 1 unit, essentially give them 4 rerolls to hit and wound. Just means that you're going to guarantee a whole ton of damage against that single target, and again it's best used on your biggest, most threatening units the majority of the time. In particular, tank commanders absolutely love this one. Combining this with a Punisher tank commander and something like Firstborn Pride can just mow straight through Plague Bearers like they're not even there, and there's very, very little in the game that efficiently kills Plague Bearers. Combine this with Hammer of Sunderance and maybe the stratagem from the Greater Good book to make it fire 12 shots, and you're almost certainly going to one-shot any one Chaos vehicle, or at least very badly damage it. It can also be used on big combined infantry squads. A favoured tactic of mine is to combine 2 infantry squads together, issue first rank, second rank fire, and deploy Vengeance for Cadia, meaning that you're getting around about 70 to 80 lasgun shots, all with 4 rerolls to hit and wound. Even if your opponent's saving on a 2+ save, they're going to fail a bunch of those just through weight of dice. It's honestly sort of got to the point where I don't tend to use this against Chaos armies unless I am playing a really competitive game, as it really does give Guard armies just one massive leg up over their Chaos counterparts. If you're playing a game against Chaos, then earmark a good 4 or 5 command points for this. You want to be using it at least the first 3 turns, and when you start to run out of command points, really weigh up as to whether or not that last command point is really going to be worth sacrificing Vengeance for Cadia on your biggest unit in the next turn. Now, that's the main stratagems from the Guard Codex. I thought I'd quickly go over some of the best ones from the other sources that are available to us. From the greater good, my favourites are Relentless, which is 1 command point to make a vehicle fight on full profile for a turn, very much like Machine Spirit Resurgent is for Imperial Knights. Having a crippled tank commander that was otherwise hitting on 5s, going back to hitting on 3s again is really powerful and easily worth a command point. But this can be well worth it on pretty much most guard vehicles, including their artillery and flyers. We did mention it briefly earlier, but Hail of Fire, the 2 command point one to make a Lehman Russ automatically roll max number of shots for its turret weapon is really powerful. Getting a flat 12 shots out of the Hammer of Sunderance or Lehman Russ Demolisher can be game changing, and is well worth the 2 command points. I typically want to use it on a tank commander rather than a regular Russ because you're going to hit with a lot more of those shots. But this, in combination with some of the other stratagems or the various other buffs that tank commanders have available, can really allow you to solve the biggest problem in your opponent's army with one brutal Hail of Fire. We've already gone over tank aces in another video, and I recommend checking it out if you haven't already. The 1 command point to make one of your tanks a tank ace is possibly one of the other best command points that you'll ever spend in the Imperial Guard. They have some really strong abilities, and it's a shame that we're only limited to 2 at maximum. This one is an absolute auto-include for me if I'm taking either tanks or artillery, and I expect to see it in pretty much every Guard competitive list. Finally, from the Vigilus formation Emperor's Wrath Artillery Company, we have the Pounding Barrage. 2 command points to make your Basilisk or Wyvern fire again is great, mainly because you can choose which one you want to target. If you're facing a load of infantry, then fire the Wyvern twice, and if you're facing a bunch of heavy armour, then fire the Basilisk twice. Again, this can be stacked with various other things, including that aerial spotter stratagem that we mentioned, or things like overlapping fields or Firstborn Pride, and the other buffs that you can get from the Emperor's Wrath Artillery Company. So, those are my favourite stratagems. Let me know if you disagree with any of the rankings on this list, and whether or not you think I've overvalued or undervalued any of our stratagems. I do think that they're one of the more skilled aspects to Warhammer 40k, and recognising which ones are strong and which ones are underwhelming for the cost can be a bit of a tricky part of the game, particularly for newer players. Thanks very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics video. If you've enjoyed it, feel free to subscribe for more Guard content every 2 days, and plenty of other things for the rest of 40k as well. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, so if you are enjoying the videos regularly, then any support that you can spare would be greatly appreciated, as the Patreon is what lets me focus on making these videos quite so much, as it does take time away from my actual real-world job. And of course, a big thank you to those already supporting. In any case, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.